It minimizes your risks and liability. Therefore, you keep more money to the bottom line and not out the door.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Hey folks, we're in for another show of Simply Trade Podcast, and I am looking forward to today's discussion and with somebody who's been on the show a few times, but it's also somebody I have a lot of respect for and is a good friend. Melzie Wilson, who is in the center of the universe there in Memphis, Tennessee. And I am no longer in Memphis there, Melzie. I have moved to Searcy, Arkansas. Can you believe that? I am the finance director now for the city here in Searcy. And so I am fairly new into the job and drinking from the fire hose, but having a great time with that and meeting new people and all, as well as then continuing on with the podcast. So it's a lot of fun here. So with that, we're going to be talking about, folks, something that is going to be practical and something hopefully we will stimulate some ideas for you and something that you need to look at, review yourself. If you haven't done it, you need to put it on your to-do list. And that is something about creating standard operating procedures. But in this, Melzie, what aspect are we going to be looking at is like, if I want to try and do some SOPs and all of that, how do I even get ready? What do I do if I'm new into a department and I'm coming in, or I've been there a long time and, it's like everybody gets complacent? What should we do here?
Well, in today's age with all the electronics and applications, I think we're getting away from just good old fashioned back to the basics. We do that in every aspect. What's the latest bells and whistles? But let's put on our memory hat and think way back when. You remember the old folios that sat on your desk and they were A through Z, and it was the card, and up at the top it had the name and the contact. And as things changed, as a customs broker, that's what I was doing when those were the rage. You had classification for this. It started out nice and neat, and then you had a scratch off as it changed or a ruling came in, and you took that ruling and you stapled it to or clipped it to that existing little SOP that you had, and it just kept growing until there was a need to write a new one, and then you took that new one, wrote it up, and clipped it to the front because that was your latest one you had. And so where we have great systems today where we can input a lot of this into our systems and generate very accurate and consistent information, I think the old school approach and starting out with a document that can easily be shared, and that both parties, whether or not you are the service provider or that cargo owner that's wanting the service, whether it's trucking, import, export, international transportation, we're getting away from that these days. And we need consistency, especially as we're seeing our imports and exports, especially become more complicated in the approach with exports and the adding of PGAs and the, constant changing of ECCNs and sanctions that we're dealing with. I think that there is a great need to step back, put on our hat 20 plus years ago, and what worked then.
Well, to that point, Melzie, Yeah, it's to your point. It's that one of the things that when people try to look at it, you've got AI tools now that supposedly, everybody's like, oh, well, let's just run it and it'll create a contract for you. It'll create a document. It's like, you know what? There comes a point where, yeah, you may want some, what's the word I'm looking for? Automation that will do some of the work for you. But I mean, quite frankly, for an effective, detailed, informative SOP on your processes and all that, you've got to sit down and just literally go through it. And I've had people look at it and go, all right, well, we want to flow chart some of this or whatever. Okay, still, you come back and say, all right, let me take a scenario. Don't sit there and go so general. Take a scenario and say, all right, we've got goods coming from the factory, let's say in, Guadalajara, Mexico. And they are coming into the U.S. into a particular distribution center. So let's literally take this from the standpoint that you can take it from the customer order. It's then generated, whatever. You could take it from the purchase order and go through and say, all right, they're manufacturing. Now they're holding them and now they're going to be shipping them in. But you literally, step 1, step 2, step 3. That's the one that I usually will go through and say, just write it down. What do you do now? What do you do next? And a lot of times they'll get into it. And then all of a sudden, oh, we forgot about that step. Well, I'll go back and put it in. It's like, well, I've already got numbers 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, well, this is 2A or 2B or whatever it is.
You bring up a good point, Andy, in the fact that it highlights one thing. No two importers are the same. I can bring in the same trade lane, same commodity, and different importers or exporters have a different approach. Same way with that custom broker or that freight forwarder. They all, and most everyone, operates differently. And one of the things we see in onboarding is that let's say you have a contract, talked about AI, using AI intelligence to generate your contract. That's fine and dandy, but that operator at that desk level is never going to see that contract. There should always be a separate engagement with the team. Know your audience. If you have verbiage, let's say you're in the medical field or technology and your specifics are written as though it's geared toward an engineer or someone with some type of technology background. I'm just going to say engineer no matter what, or a doctorate degree in pharmaceuticals. The operator is not. They're darn good at what they do, but they're not going to have that high level technical background in your product. So you have to look at it from who in your operations is going to be talking to that service provider and do the language as it relates to the mutual understanding of how you want your business handled. It's very key. And I've seen it all too often where that doesn't happen. And that's where you get the mistakes. That's where you get the escalations, because in that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, everybody's abiding by the regulatory standard, but how you approach the operation and your service provider and how your own operations work. I'll never forget, used to have a client. They did they didn't get their documents until they paid for the goods. So the finance guy in his brain was making a decision to pay for the goods at the very last minute. Therefore, we didn't get the documentation as their customs broker to handle the goods in a timely manner. So there was a frustration from the service provider thinking that their contact was not doing their job when it was totally out of their hands. So there was assumptions made on both parts when it could have been easily solved on that onboarding on the front end with key parties in and how it flows to make that point to the finance guy. Hey, understand your position, but guess what? We could be clearing your goods 5 days out. We cannot do that.
Well, and the way the process, and see, that's something right there that I think is very important. So I came up with a little thing. Lots of people work it and whatever I call the PPD, package, paperwork, and data. And with that is that when you're doing your SOPs and you're writing down your procedures of what's going on, because writing down your procedures is the same thing as your SOPs. I mean, you may make some modifications, but step 1, step 2, step 3, whatever. But I think you have to look at it, and I'd love your opinion on this. Maybe you're doing the same kind of thing. You just call it something different. But I always had the physical movement of the shipment. That's the package part of it. It's like, okay, something's ready to go. It could be a pallet. It could be a whole plane load of stuff. It could be just a small little parcel. But the package itself is physical. It has to move through the physical realm, and you have to map that out, if you will, or the steps and what's needed. Second is the paperwork. In filling out the bill of lading to the commercial invoice, to the purchase orders, to the whatever happens in the entry and who and your vendors, and getting information to different places. And then the third thing would be the data. There's times in today's world, especially, you have data flows, data files that are exchanged and different things of that day. That needs to look at how is that working and when does it go and what's the flow of that? But also the timelines on every one of those is so paramount. The package may be, all right, you got a pick and pack order. It's going through and it may be sitting on the dock, but the data for that shipment can go ahead and start uploading to different systems and to different vendors, and then the paperwork's generated from that, and then it's married up. There's multiple updates and all that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree with that approach when you're looking at and understanding the business. Is one key thing that the importer, exporter, or domestic warehouse that or whomever has the goods, you need to explain to the service provider that exact thing. How is the package flowing? Is the paperwork flowing? And is there any data, electronics? How is that moving through your supply chain? And then in turn, that service provider needs to explain and over how their process flows. Are you having the right people at the desk and or at the table, so to speak, in communicating this? Because we all love our marketing sales guys, but a lot of times there are decisions made that are commitments made based upon securing that business that doesn't flow exactly to the operations, and even to an import-export manager over that particular product for that company in that location, and therefore flow to the operator. You start off with escalations. It's so easy to get everything correct up front. And I think this is it. It really hit home. I always believed in this very strongly, but one thing I really have to commend huge kudos to FedEx in that when a client is, because I was in managed accounts, and in managed accounts, you could not come into managed accounts until there was a solid SOP in place that everybody understood, because that eliminated any errors or misguidance, because a lot of times, as I stated, something was committed, and then when operations, when we would get and work with your former team, Andy, in making sure that we had everything possible, there was disconnects or a report that we just couldn't do that would entail engagement with the IT department to write something. So that's one of the key elements I really loved, and I really brought to heart the aspect.
Well, and to that point, let me say this to our listeners, folks. Here's one of the things I think is extremely important, especially if you are so frustrated with one of your service providers that they don't seem to be performing or fulfilling your expectations, and they're not getting you the reports, or they're not getting you the service, or they're not, or they're charging you more than you feel like you should be, and whatever the case may be. Here's something that with both Melzie and I, looking at in our experience, I will tell you that one of the biggest things that I was trying to do while I was at FedEx, and it really helped, but it's like you apply this principle no matter where you're at. And that's where you've got to align your expectations. Make sure your expectations as a client, as a customer, are put out there, and then work with your service providers, your customs brokers, your transportation companies, and your handlers, and the warehouses. You need to really look at all of that and align with them to make sure that, one, your service provider knows what your expectations are. Two, you need to also be flexible enough that service provider may not be able to fulfill your expectations. You may be a bit unreasonable. Regardless, it's like everybody should do it. No, wait a minute, just back up a minute, because changing a service provider that is integrated into your process is a big deal. And I would rather work with your service provider and try and work out what's amiable. Here's where I was going to say is, again, align those expectations so you both know what you can expect from your service provider in whatever services they're providing. But the other thing is, if a service provider comes back, and I had to do this a lot, I'm sorry, we can't do what you're looking for in this step. However, now this is what was different. I would come back, here's our alternative. So if you're a service provider, you don't just say, nope, we can't do that and leave it alone. You need to come back and say, well, what is it you're trying to accomplish? Here's our alternatives. Here's some of the other things we can do. And it usually turned out that the way we accomplish things and the thing, it was even the service was superior to what their expectations were, because we worked together on it.
Right. Because everybody can be on the same system. There's a very well-known brand out there that is used by the industry, and I call it the Beast. And it does any and everything, but it all depends on, you may have secured another service provider that uses that same system, but what module did they buy? How did they use the system? And it varies. I mean, you're spot on in the level of expectation. I always say that when you're onboarding, you should be meeting with that client, depending on your volume. You should be meeting have a sit down and set up calls do pre-onboarding of the client, make sure that's okay, expectations are met. And then when the service starts, keep it as a living document. An SOP is not a one and done.
It's not
it is a
one and
living
done. Oh, that
document.
is so important. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, when there is personnel changes on the service provider side or on the engagement party side, you need to be having another sit down. Well, I don't know who to call, or so-and-so, they're out, but I don't have a tier 2 person to contact. What is my escalation process? All of this should be known up front. And one key thing that I've added to the mix with this is we are in a unfortunate era of cybersecurity, and where it completely shuts down your operating systems. That's your email. And I remember when Maersk was attacked, it even attacked their phone systems and their cell phones, because it was all connected together.
Connected into the servers nowadays. Yep.
Right. So in regard to that, and it doesn't have to be out there because, there's personal phones that aren't used for company business, as well as there's emails that are your personal. What's your backup plan? That should be known in the very beginning, because it has to be known on both sides, because freight still keeps moving. But what's our backup plan? What is your plan for me to communicate with you if I don't have those means?
Well, here's something too that
simple.
as we go through some things here, I guess, folks, I mean, when you're talking about doing these SOPs and all, and we've touched on some things that this could be a behemoth of a project. And it's like, wait a minute. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So in that scenario, there is that you pick, again, the scenario is like, it's all right. You from Guadalajara to the U.S. or from China to the U.S. or whatever the case is, wherever your supplies are. And as you go through, one of the other challenges that I always like to put forward is, as especially, in the express world, but I mean, it applies to any mode of transportation: ocean, rail, truck, air cargo, air express. Is
imports, exports, warehousing. Expectations must be addressed and understand the service you want and the service that service provider can give to you.
And to that point, here's where I was going to say, I agree. Right there is all the way through is, if you are the client, what will it take for all the information that's required to be on the paperwork at the origin? So when that origin courier or trucking company, whatever, picks up your shipment, all the information is on that paperwork up front: the classification, the special declarations, the government declarations, the OGAs and all that. All right. So here's the thing. All of a sudden people look at it and go, well, wait a minute. Now let me say where usually this is where, to me, if you can't trust the paperwork, and I always ask this question, let me just ask it real quick and then I'll go on to the comment, is do you trust the commercial invoice and the paperwork that comes with the shipment from the origin? And if the answer is, oh no, we don't trust the classification of it, well, if from a compliance standpoint, then you have not done your job. I'm sorry if that hurts your feelings. I may be plowing too close to the corn for you, but doggone it, it's like you need to reach out and figure out in your process with all the people, what will it take to get all that information on that paperwork up front? So that means a whole lot of collaboration, data flows, and everything else. But if you go with that objective, Melzie, does that not empower the service provider so they don't have to look up at a database or somewhere else? It's already there on the paperwork.
Correct. And all too often we see those classifications incorrect. Where the SOP states specifically, do not go by the classification provided on commercial documentation. Please use our SOP. Please go by the SKU or description of the commodity from that particular manufacturer or reseller, and go to your database. And speaking of databases go along with your SOP, as it should be shared minimum on a quarter. If you have a huge turnaround of products and introducing new products or changing SKUs or making any adjustments whatsoever, be proactive. Speak to your service provider and make sure they have that information. One of the things, and I think I've said it with various clients many times this week already, don't assume. Do not assume anything. Well, it's always been that way. No. When was the last time you talked to that client or you talked to anyone about what your expectations are So constant engagement, SOP. And I would ask, if you are working with somebody that doesn't use an SOP template or you're not using one, be a little bit concerned. There are many variations and approaches to an SOP, but bottom line, it's got to be there. It's got to be there. Don't assume people changing, systems changing, buyouts of companies, upper management structure. Someone may come in and change the whole dynamics. You might have used a provider that gave carte blanche, added value services that when they see something of a compliance concern and they know your product, they just send it on to you. It could be that your next provider or your other provider doesn't have that service automatic within their environment, and you need to be asking and not assuming that when there's something that comes out in a CSMS message, if you see something from ICPA, NCBFAA, if you see something, you're automatically going to engage. So, don't assume. Do not assume anything whatsoever.
Well, and also the other thing is to look at it is like, we were talking about, specific lane segment. The other thing is to also look at doing SOPs for, your standard administrative things. You've already hit it on, for example, a database of your parts listing or your items that you're selling and all that. Listen, a part doesn't just happen. And so you've got to look in it, and there are usually weeks involved, if not months, in the design development of a part. The sourcing or purchasing folks that then, when it goes through and it's designed and then they start sourcing out for a manufacturer or source to provide that item. So often the compliance folks are left out. So, in that, then everything's going fine. And then all of a sudden here comes a shipment and it's like, well, we don't know about it. What's the classification? Oh, hey, guess what? There's FDA involved or agriculture or, EPA or whatever the case may be. So, working collaboratively, you need to look to see how is a part added to your parts database. And are you involved in that? And don't assume, just like what you said, Melzie, I think it's so important. But here's the thing. If you've got that documented and you check that out and it's, you can go back and review that. You may only have to review that maybe once a year because there's probably no major changes. But, if you do an acquisition, you need to pull that out and say, well, here's how we do it. How are you doing it? Where's where are the files? And then who gets it? Sharing it. That is so important. So you've hit the nail on the head on a lot of things.
So one of my most famous stories, and I tell this and I'll probably tell it again at ICPA. I had a client, an import client, this many years ago, and I had a client who, longstanding business, we had their database, we were doing everything right, but there's a big old but. Our contacts didn't know. So we didn't make any changes, but they had a situation on both of our control. It had stemmed from an overseas supplier. But in the midst of my attorney friend doing this, he fell upon something, and he and his audit team fell upon something. The client, the engineers were able to change this particular component from metal to a resin plastic that worked in the same environment. Guess what? Huge change in duties. And so they had to go back. We had to go back, invest time that we couldn't recoup. They as well on pulling shipments, doing post summary corrections, etc., to get it all straightened out. And it could have been prevented if, one, their engineering had been talking to their compliance people and they had been able to convey it to us, because there was money left on the table because it was outside being able to protest. So there was money left on the table on top of that. And especially these days with everything changing, I've been in DC, working with, aluminum and the smelting and the melting and the certificates. And even though it's changed, from, and changing substantial character and under another classification, you're still going to have to pay dumping duty on that portion that was the original form that went into that final product. So it's not getting easier in communication and understanding, because guess what? Your customs broker is not going to know that little bitty element unless you were having continuous dialogue with them.
And that's where those quarterly, at a bare minimum, a quarterly, business review, some call it a quarterly broker review. Doesn't matter. It's where you get your team together. And the other part of this is don't just do it with just your broker. It's like having, or just your compliance group, having your customer service to your IT, to everybody's in that room. It's like a logistics council type of a thing. That is, I've seen companies use that, and it is so effective, because all of a sudden they go, well, we didn't know about that, or what's going on. It's like, for example, the Houthis that are attacking the cargo ships. Well, guess what? Our cycle times are going up, because now the cargo ships that we are using are having to go around the Cape of Africa or whatever. And so the impact there. So, all right. Well, let me just say how it is in trying to wrap this up. It also would be good, I think, for people to look at this. I know it's an onerous objective here, but we need to look to see how getting an expert involved in helping to write your SOPs, that is money that is well spent. So if you're an executive of a company and you're looking at this and you want to see this go, I'm telling you, it is one of the best money you can spend in this, just to say, what are we doing? You can't figure out how to improve things if you don't know and have it documented on what are you doing today.
Right. You can't use a cookie. You can use a cookie cutter approach in the base. But like I said, everybody's unique. Everybody has a different approach and different needs. So if you can't do it internally, there's people like us that's what we do. We listen to what you have to say, and then knowing, the logistics, knowing what services are, and then have it meet in the middle. Either have it as a universal application of what your needs are, and then tone it, and then adhere that basic universal approach to someone's unique needs or services they can provide for you. So, because like I say, all of us operate differently, and all of us have different needs. So honing in on that is very key to a very successful, because what my thing is scream with SOS or success with an SOP.
Yep. Well, and I will say, folks, this is one of those things where I'm going to tell you, of what we hit today, is there's definitely a lot of things you can do on your own, but there's also a lot of things where you need somebody that is knowledgeable about your supply chain to help you navigate through there. You get your SOPs done, and it's going to make you all look like heroes in every aspect of it. The transportation, the warehouse, the compliance, the IT, all of this stuff that goes on. And I'm telling you, it will be a team effort that to upper management, you guys will get a home run out of that. So
it minimizes your risks and liability. Therefore, you keep more money to the bottom line and not out the door.
There you go. Well, Melzie, I appreciate it. Folks, we're going to have Melzie Wilson's contact information with our show notes. But I also will say that, I highly suggest, this isn't a commercial for you, Melzie. You haven't talked about this, but I'm going to say Melzie's one to be great to reach out to. But also just, if it's not Melzie, if it's other companies out there or whatever, just take the step. Look at what we've talked about. If you've got some questions, reach out to us and we can maybe guide you to some folks out there that would be appropriate for you.
And come to my session at ICPA.
Oh, yes. We forgot about that. ICPA, it's like, all right, the fall conference in Dallas, Texas. It's coming up in October. If you're not, if you haven't made plans to attend, look, Dallas is easy to get to. It's going to be a lot of fun. And Melzie's going to be there. I'm going to be there. Lalo will be there and all. And please come to that. And this would be a great working session type of session with Melzie.
A lot of engagement, a lot of little hints, a lot of things I've seen in the war room throughout my career. So, yeah.
There you go. All right, Melzie, thank you so much. Folks, we're going to turn this all back over to you. Thank you so much for listening. And again, share us, reach out to us, reach out to Melzie and LinkedIn, reach out to me and Lalo. Thank you so much, Melzie.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest in the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.